are moving forward with a bill that would shield chemical companies from lawsuits over their products.
Protecting produce or protecting the pockets of massive corporations. A bill waiting to be signed into Georgia law will prohibit people from suing pesticide companies.
This is so wrong. The chemical industries are trying to quietly pass something in a bill that, if they pass this, all lawsuits where people were harmed or injured from pesticides will go away.
Are we being poisoned, and soon could it be legal? A new bill might actually allow companies to use pesticides and not be held accountable for any problem they occur. Is this something we really should be worried about? And let's see what the evidence has to say. Hi, I'm Dr. Eric Westman, and welcome to my channel where I review and debunk nutritional misinformation online. In this video by Dr. Paul Saladino, who's an influencer in the keto, low-carb, carnivore or carnivore-ish space, goes through some of the ideas around pesticides, and I'm reminded that we really need to be scientific about this, even though there's common sense involved. And for heaven's sakes, why would we want to be exposed to vegetables in the first place? And pesticides are generally used on vegetables. So be sure to wait till the end where you hear my final thoughts.
Let's talk about some of the science behind glyphosate, science that says it's not a problem, science that says it is a problem, and what we can say at this point. The overarching narrative here is that the science is complicated. We have to look at dosing, whether humans could reasonably get these doses in our lifetimes. And as you will see, we also must look at adjuvants. These are additives to formulations like Roundup, which, as you will see, appear to make the sum formula of those pesticides plus adjuvants look more harmful than single ingredients like glyphosate. And we also need to understand that glyphosate is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to pesticides. There are others like Dacthal, there are others like 2,4-D, and what are the additive effects of all of these in humans? I think most people listening to this will understand that pesticides are probably not a good thing for humans at all.
Well, so there were some meetings on keto diets, low-carb diets that were very scientific, where meeting research was being presented or summaries. And there happened to be a few lectures at these meetings that I thought were a little strange. It hadn't crossed my mind that glyphosate was a problem, really, because in the clinical trials that I do, cutting carbs out, people will reduce their consumption of vegetables independent of whether there's glyphosate or not. Glyphosate is in Roundup. So I started to get into this idea, well, let's see what the evidence says. And when presented with the need to back up their claims, the idea that the pesticides are bad starts to kind of deteriorate in terms of scientific proof. And now there can be hype about it, and sure, the general consensus or face validity, like Dr. Saladino is saying here, is that they're probably not good for humans. But, there are a lot of things that happen that may not be good for humans, but we don't get upset about it and try to, have meetings about how to reduce these kinds of things. So, I was trained in clinical trials where you would want an experiment to really isolate out the element that you're worried about. And so in the one study that I was able to find on different levels of pesticide exposure, glyphosate exposure, and there was a group that had no exposure that they knew about, there wasn't any change in the cancers, and there was an association with one, but it wasn't statistically significant. So if you weren't statistically minded, you might even say that there was a different amount of cancer in those groups, but the statistical significance is important because you want to be sure that it's real and not just kind of artificially there. So I came to this thinking that I would find, well, ideally a randomized trial of people getting pesticides or not. No, that hasn't happened to my knowledge, but they have sorted out people in the amount of exposure to these pesticides and haven't found a strong association with any kind of illness. There are a lot of anecdotes about overdoses with these pesticides. Someone might get a Parkinson's-like neurologic disease if they had, drank a bunch of pesticide, or they might have sudden death as a result of that. And so let's just say that I'm not talking about severe overdose. I think this is well known that you can die from the exposure. It's poisonous over a certain level. What we're talking about here, under conditions of typical use, going to the store and getting something that has pesticides on it and you wash it, are you really at higher risk?
If you could avoid these, why wouldn't you? Unless you really thought they were not bad for humans at all. But if there was a shred of evidence that they were harmful in any way, shape, or form, I think most of us would avoid these. It's also worth pointing out at this moment that there is a really interesting paper I've spoken about many times in the past from Bruce Ames. And the title of that paper is Dietary Pesticides, 99.9% All Natural. Now, granted, this paper was written in the 1980s before glyphosate was used widely in the food supply. But the point he is making in that paper is that the majority of the, quote, pesticides that we consume in our diets are actually from the plants themselves. And perhaps we shouldn't worry about pesticides on food if 99.9% of the pesticides are in the plants we are eating. Well, I look at that a little differently and think we should probably worry about the pesticides we're spraying on the plants. Yes, because we don't really know what those do in humans. And if we could avoid using them, we should. We should minimize our exposure as much as possible, but we should also not ignore the fact that there are massive amounts of pesticides made by plants that are there to discourage the consumption of the vegetable parts of plants. This is the reason that I do what I do, you guys, to let people know about the fact that vegetables may not be great for humans after all.
Well, that's a really good point, that there may be these toxins inside the plants themselves, so why eat them at all? But that's not the point here. So Bruce Ames is a predominant, well-renowned name in science, coming up with an Ames test for looking at carcinogenicity, and that he wrote a paper basically saying, don't get concerned about the insecticides or pesticides that are being sprayed because there's already that inside the plant. I'm kind of on Paul's side here, where it doesn't mean that it's okay or good for you.
I'll show you the paper here from Bruce Ames. Dietary pesticides, 99.9% all natural. We estimate that Americans eat 1.5 grams of natural pesticides per person per day, about 10,000 times more than they eat of synthetic pesticide residues. Now, all of these are not created equally. Perhaps we have some ability to detoxify these plant pesticides. I would say that plant pesticides probably have a longer history within human biology, and we can deal with some of them. I don't think plant pesticides are great for humans, or synthetic pesticides should be a part of our diet in any significant amount.
Yeah, I think Dr. Saladino at this point, 2022, was promoting a carnivore diet at the time, meaning no vegetables at all. And he's come back from that a little bit since then. But the logic, it's interesting that if we're all eating some toxins anyway, why would more toxins be bad? I mean, I don't buy that either. So we want to minimize risk, of course. And even in the studies that I found of different levels of insecticide or pesticide intake, not the extreme exposure, but a little bit of exposure, the group that was the comparative group had some disease as well. So we're not talking about comparing to a group that has no disease at all. In these studies, it just says adding insecticide or pesticide doesn't increase the rate of cancers or other problem beyond what is typically seen. And so short of any sort of randomized trial prospective study going forward, where you control for as many things as you can, we're left with the kind of face validity, meaning common sense of, well, we want to try to minimize our exposures to that best we can, reduce the vegetable consumption, reduce the pesticide consumption, and whether there should be regulation about it. At what level of evidence do we require to have some sort of nationwide or policy to restrict something? I think the level of evidence should be pretty high. The level of evidence to get FDA approval, meaning a company is allowed to market a drug, it means you have randomized trials, prospective studies, experimental studies proving that well, as best we can, proving that the medication is actually helpful beyond placebo or some other kind of control group. I don't see that kind of research being done in this space.
It's also therefore very interesting when we see anecdotes of people who get rid of vegetables, admittedly, along with other things, and see improvements in their autoimmune symptoms. So the hypothesis that arises from that is, are there some people in who vegetables may trigger autoimmunity? That's an interesting sort of idea that I've come across in this research about optimal diets for humans. Again, not the topic of today's podcast, but something to understand that is an overarching interest of mine, overarching theme in the work that I do.
Yeah, so the studies that I'm most familiar with, dietary randomized trials, you follow people prospectively. We don't tell people to reduce their pesticide exposure. We don't tell people to reduce their seed oil exposure, but that might be happening along the way because you're eating less vegetables, fewer vegetables, less vegetable matter. So it could be that this is an issue. I just don't see that it's been isolated out and proven, much like the seed oil issue is. So that the idea of low carbohydrates as a treatment and telling people what to do, prospective studies, this is solid science. This is settled. Now, are the seed oil reduction and pesticide reduction part of the pathophysiology, the improvements that happens for people with inflammation and other neurodegenerative issues? Possibly, but it hasn't been proven. So from my standpoint, if you're a patient of mine, you want to be very careful about the vegetables that you do eat, and the broader kind of policy decision of let's take away all pesticides, let's take away all seed oils. I just don't know if that's going to make a big dent in the disease that we see today. I do know that cutting carbs and cutting vegetables, because vegetables have carbs, can make a big dent in chronic disease today. The studies are there. I see it in my practice. So I'm kind of like Dr. Saladino here. If you can't totally get rid of the exposure, minimize it if you can. But is it really the benefit coming from the avoidance of the vegetables rather than the pesticides on the vegetables? I think that's an open question. And my experience is I can tell people just to avoid the vegetables and they get better without regard to the seed oil or the pesticide controversy. So are these just things that are glommed on the low carb, the lower carb, the keto benefits of metabolism? Possibly. It would be interesting to see, for example, let's say a state that bans the pesticides and follows human health. If it's really dangerous, you would see things change pretty quickly, although, food could come from other states. And so it's a tough study to do going forward. And I'm just not convinced that a lot of benefit is there, but it might be. If you like, please like this video and subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss out on future content. Look for new videos on Wednesdays and Fridays. If you enjoyed this video, consider joining our YouTube membership for early access and exclusive live Q&As with me. Just click the join button below or support us with a PayPal in the description.